Okay, good evening to one and all. Thank you so much for visiting NTU, one of the top 15 most beautiful campuses in the world, and attending today's lecture. My name is Ken Lam. Before we begin our lecture proper, I have a few housekeeping matters. First of all, may I request that you turn your mobile gadgets to silent mode, please? And in case of emergencies, there are 2 exits behind you, and of course 2 doors in front of you as well. The third thing is this: we are, as part of our Go Green Eco Campus, we are doing away with pen and paper survey. So if you don't mind, at the end of the lecture, please spend a couple of minutes, give us some of our feedback through this online. You can actually scan the QR code, scan it, and we appreciate your feedback so that we can try to make the talk even better in future. We are also trying to do away with bottled water. Again, this is part of the Go Green initiative. So for those of you who need to drink water, we have a water fountain right outside on my right. Okay. Now, NTU has done very well in terms of research and education, and we would like to leverage on our strengths in these 2 areas to benefit the community. So in July 2017, we started this initiative called the Did You Know Talk series. Every month we invite one of the top professors to share his or her area of interest. And in so doing, we hope that we are able to help Singaporeans or audience like you to appreciate research and its benefits. So today we are very honored to have Professor Joseph Liao as our guest speaker to talk about the geopolitical and geoeconomics trends, what lies ahead for Singapore. Now, Prof. Liao obtained his PhD degree from the London School of Economics. He is currently our Dean of our College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, and Professor for Comparative and International Politics at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU, Singapore. Prof. Liao held the inaugural Lee Kuan Yew Chair in Southeast Asia Study at Brookings Institute, Washington, D.C., USA. His research areas encompass Muslim politics and social movements in Southeast Asia, and geopolitics and geoeconomics of Asia-Pacific region. Now, he's the author, co-author, and editor of 14 books. Now, if you read the Straits Times, you will see that he, as a regular columnist for the Straits Times, his commentaries have appeared in New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, National Interest, Nikkei Asian Review, and of course the Wall Street Journal. Prof. Liao has testified to the US Congress, briefed to the ASEAN ministers, defense ministers meeting, and of course consulted a wide range of multinational corporations and MNCs. So without further ado, let's put our hands together to welcome Professor Joseph Liao. Prof. Liao, thanks.
Thank you, Ken Lam. I'm very impressed. I think you memorized, Yeah, you memorized my, wow, okay, good, very good. I'm impressed. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm very mindful that it is Friday evening, in fact, Friday night. So while I am very honored that you all have decided to spend your Friday night here. Part of me also wondering why, right? But never mind. Thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to all of you on some thing rather big picture kind of issues. And what I will do is really just share some of my thoughts. These are issues that I follow on a close basis. So I want to take this opportunity to just share some of my thoughts on them and relate them probably towards the end of the talk to Singapore and what the future may or may not hold for Singapore, right? So I suppose when we talk about the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the region, the obvious thing, the thing that really shouts out to you is the ongoing trade war, right, between the US and China. Now, the first thing we should bear in mind is that as exciting as the dynamics of this trade war are, and they are unfolding as we speak because President Trump is going to meet Liu He in Washington in a few hours, in fact. Yep. But as exciting as it is, we have to remember that trade wars are, or at least tariffs are not exactly new phenomenon, right, in international affairs. We've seen it many times. The US has used tariffs going all the way back to Johnson, Nixon, Carter, Reagan. Everyone was using, at some point or other, tariffs on steel to some degree or other, right? In 2002, George W. Bush tried to push tariffs on steel against the EU, against China, and got the tariffs got overturned in the WTO. So the WTO plays quite a significant role in this. President Obama himself had enacted tariffs on Chinese car tires, right? And the Chinese appealed to the WTO, lost their case, and retaliated by placing tariffs on on American chicken imports. Yeah, such is the world of tariffs and counter tariffs. So tariffs are not new, but why is the current situation so causing such anxiety? I think there are a number of things to bear in mind. The first is the general climate especially in the United States, with regards to the policies of the current administration. It is quite clear, I think it's quite clear that we are looking at a society that is very polarized in the US. Yeah, and the mood surrounding tariffs is one that is driven by a very, very populist enterprise, right? And Donald Trump has been riding that crest all the way into the Oval Office and continues to be fanning the flames of populism, which is, of course, in his world, correlated to fake news, right? Anything that doesn't work in his favor is fake news. So that there is that climate, right? Number one. Number two, and this is something a little bit different from previous epochs when the United States launched or enacted tariffs, and that is the national security imperative. The Trump administration and the advocates of tariffs in the Trump administration has couched tariffs in the language of national security, right? If you want to draw a simple connection, it's basically, and Trump himself has gone on record to draw that very simplistic Trumpish type of connection. The US is being ripped off by the rest of the world, not just China, the rest of the world. And because it's being ripped off by the rest of the world, it has less money to spend on defense. And mind you, he is a president who wants to spend a lot more than he can on defense. And because he cannot spend on defense, the security of the country is compromised. Right? Very simple in Trump's world. So there is that national security logic to it as well. And third is, of course, I mentioned the populist mood, and we will remember that for this president, he basically campaigned on the back of being firmer against a whole range of countries, not just China, a whole range of countries, including the old friends of the United States, who have been, if I may use his French, raping the United States, right? I mean, the notion of the United States being raped was used directly in relation to China, right? But the idea being that the United States is being ripped off by everyone. Now, what is distinct about the Trump administration's pursuit of this policy towards China and towards its friends? A number of things here come to mind. The first is Trump himself. Trump, if you look at people who have been commentating and writing about him, and indeed, if you look at how his ideas about the world have crystallized over time, you will see that he is someone who has, for a long time, expressed grave reservations about globalization, about free trade, etc., at least rhetorically, right? So in that sense, it is an extension of views or an expression of views that he has held for a long time. Second, I think Trump really thinks that he can win. Why does he think he can win? And here's the very intriguing and very perplexing thing about American foreign policy today. On the one hand, you talk about how possibly crazy the president might be, but he seems to be getting results. He seems to be getting results, right? Whether it's North Korea, whether it's Iran, whether it's getting the EU to increase defense spending, Trump can very proudly say that you can criticize me for as much as you want, but the fact is that I'm getting results. My policy is getting results. So I always ask myself whether this is strategic genius on his part or strategic serendipity, right? Lucky, things just seem to fall in place. I don't know, honestly, I don't know, but I always thought that that's a very intriguing question. Hi, old friend. So the thing about Trump is he actually feels that his foreign policy is a success, right? We're talking about how he's going to meet Kim Jong-un in a week, right? Yeah, about a week's time in Vietnam, and that thus far is the sort of the crown jewel of Trump foreign policy, getting North Korea to denuclearize and disarm. Except for the fact that North Korea is not going to denuclearize and disarm. My own view is that Trump got royally played by Kim Jong-un. I'm happy to elaborate on that later. But for now, our friend thinks that he has done very well. When it comes to trade and economics, another striking thing about the current situation is you're looking at an administration that has an incredible amount of turnover, right? From day one. Within a few weeks of coming into office, he lost his national security advisor, the first one that he appointed, and it's never stopped since. With one exception, or with some exceptions. The exceptions being the people who are in charge of trade and economics basically remain the same, right? It's Steve Mnuchin is there, Bob Lighthizer is there, Peter Navarro is there, Wilbur Ross is there. They were there at the beginning, they're still there. The only person, Larry Kudlow replaced Gary Cohn, the economic advisor. But other than that, look at state, right? Rex Tillerson out. National security, McMaster out. Defense, James Mattis, much to the alarm and anxiety of this part of the world, he's out as well. But his trade people, his economics people are still there. And they're all China hawks, right? To some degree or other, they are China hawks. And so it is not just the president himself. He has the entire edifice, or at least the entire edifice of his economics and trade team behind him in terms of turning the screws on China. And of course, the president thinks that unlike China, which is suffering some economic headwinds, and they are, we can talk about that in a bit, the United States is doing comparatively well. Right? He's always very fond of citing figures of unemployment, economic growth, the stock market. Although the stock market, I think, has been a bit more volatile after the imposition of tariffs. So there's some issues there. But this is the kind of approach that or the thinking and the outlook that I think is underscoring how Trump is dealing with China. And mind you, the issue of tariffs and trade war applies not only to China, applies to European allies as well. It was supposed to apply to Singapore as well, but we were very quick to tell them that, hey, actually you run a surplus with us. So that sort of took the heat off us. But as a consequence, the US kind of ignores Singapore today, which is very interesting because for a long time, Singapore, being very close friends of the United States, we always were very anxious, right, about whether or not the US pays attention to us. And it's never enough, it's never enough. However much attention the US gives to Southeast Asia and gives to Singapore is never enough. But today, I don't know, maybe under this current government, less attention might be good. So we take cover, right? While everyone takes the heat for it. So that is from on the US side. On China's side, I think that there are some serious challenges that China is facing, and far more serious than any sort of reports would let on. Now, if you were a Chinese policymaker, right, you're confronted with the US imposing tariffs on you. What do you do? What do you do? You can retaliate, right, with tariffs. And the Chinese have done that. They met the first round of 50 million, 34, 16, 50 million with their own tariffs of 50 million. But then they started to run out of steam simply because they do not import as much from the US as the US imports from China, which means that you can, you have no choice. You have fewer targets to tariff, right? So when the US increased the tariffs by another 200 million, the Chinese could only go up to 60 million. So dollar for dollar, the Chinese will lose. So the hawks in Beijing know that they can't sort of out-tariff the US. So what else can you do? Another concern is this issue of the devaluation of the Chinese currency, right? So theoretically, at least, if you devalue the currency, it would neutralize some of the effect of the tariffs, right? It would still make your exports appealing, at least theoretically. Now, the problem with that is that the Chinese have also great aspirations of making their currency an international trading currency. And having the kind of volatility that comes with these kinds of devaluation does not help its cause. Does not help its cause. And the volatility will affect not just its international aspirations, but even domestically. If you remember, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, there were 2 rounds of devaluation which freaked the Chinese government out because it led to a capital flight, right? And the Chinese had to impose currency controls on their own people in order to maintain, to have some stability. So in the long run, I don't think it wouldn't be in China's interest to devalue, which is interesting because those of you who are following, you know that they are on the verge of signing 6 MOUs, Memorandum of Understanding, on a number of issues, one of which is currency devaluation. So you can't counter tariff, you can't devalue. What can you do? Some people have suggested you sell the US bonds, sell US debt that you hold, right? So once you sell US debt, the bond prices will be driven down, the yields will increase, you create problems and instability for the American economy, and you put the squeeze on lending for the US, in the US. But that's also problematic, I think, in the long run, for a number of reasons, because demand and supply, if you start to sell, you're going to drive the prices down, and then you're going to, as you sell, you start selling, probably you end up selling at a loss at some point. You also are in a situation where selling of US debt would actually drive the value of the US dollar down, which counteracts the trade logic that you're trying to sort of stave off, right? That the value of your currency is lower than the US currency, but in that situation, you're driving the value of the US currency down. And of course, like it or not, the US dollar, the US currency is still the preferred international currency, is still the preferred savings currency. So if you sell, other people will buy. And by the way, that's what the Saudis have been doing. The Saudis have been buying up US debt, and which explains, I think, don't quote me on this, but I'm being filmed. The whole issue with Jamal Khashoggi. One of the reasons I think that the US have not turned the screws nearly enough on their good friends in Riyadh is simply because they need Riyadh on their side in terms of buying up more US bonds. Yeah. So it's not even a slap on the wrist. The administration talked tough during the investigation, and nothing came out of it as far as American actions or any sort of policy shift with regards to Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So the Chinese are in a very difficult position because on the one hand, you playing tough with the US is not. It's going to be challenging for them. On the other hand, you can't possibly just cave in, right? Xi Jinping cannot be seen doing what the Americans want him to do. Even though, and I will say this, what the Americans want him to do is actually good for China, right? Liberalizing the economy, reforming the state-owned enterprises, tightening their intellectual property regime. All these, in the long run, will be good for China. But politically, he cannot be seen making concessions to the United States, of all people, to the United States, right? And certainly not in the situation where you have already hyped yourself up, right? I think one of the problems that China is dealing with is the consequences of having hyped themselves up. Ever since people say the Beijing Olympics, I think not that far back, but certainly a few years ago. And you can see that at the 19th Party Congress, right? A couple of years ago, where it really came across as if China had, if it hadn't already arrived, it's going to arrive soon. And China talked itself into a corner because of that. And now they find themselves having to find a way out of that corner. And here is where we are very concerned, or at least I'm very concerned, because there doesn't appear in the US the US doesn't seem to have any appetite or inclination to provide the Chinese with an off-ramp, right? I'll give you an example of what I mean. So one of the sort of mantras of China is the Made in China 2025 policy, right? Which encompasses not just technology. I mean, we know the technology part of it, but also high quality infrastructure and productivity and all that sort of stuff, right? And it's a signature initiative on the part of Xi Jinping. He has two, right? The BRI and Made in China 2025. And President Trump comes along and says that he takes offense, personal offense, at Made in China 2025, right? Of course, you can say that you take offense with it, we just change the name, right? But I think it's a bit more complicated than that. So it creates an unnecessary problem for your adversary, especially if you do actually want to try to work something out, right? It makes it all the more difficult, I think, for China. So I think as far as the immediate policy options are concerned for the Chinese, there is always the option of falling back to the tried and tested economic stimulus through infrastructure investments, which is where the BRI comes in, right? Because domestic infrastructure, unless you're talking about the outer regions, domestic infrastructure in the coastal areas already saturated already. So you got to expand out, which is why the BRI is very important for China from a domestic perspective as well. But the BRI, there are a lot of problems with the BRI. And I think we are all familiar with those problems. I don't think I want to elaborate too much on that. People talked about debt trap and debt diplomacy. I have a few things to say about that. Number one is, yes, it is certainly a risk as far as the partner countries are concerned. And it is a risk at a very high level, at the government level. Right? That's the interesting thing about the BRI. The BRI is supposed to be some kind of a reconstitution of the old Silk Road. But there's a fundamental difference, right? The old Silk Road was organic. It was, shall we say, a private sector enterprise back in the day. It's a, equivalent of a private sector enterprise. The BRI is anything but a private sector enterprise, right? It's a G2G, government to government enterprise. It's not even multilateral, it's bilateral, right? Most of it is bilateral. The Chinese are slowly coming around to the fact that they can't do this on their own. They need partners, so they've reached out to the Japanese, they've reached out to Singapore, they've reached out to Australia, and that creates problems for the potential partners, right? Because some of these projects, you really scratch your head and ask yourself, what is the commercial value? Some you can see commercial values, others you can't, which speaks to a very interesting facet of the BRI. On the one hand, it's supposed to be this large, almost strategic plan. But on the other hand, once you pass it down or pass it out, you realize that it's actually just little arrangements, little bilateral arrangements here and there, sort of lumped together. It's no surprise that there's no real geographical scope to the BRI, right? Because it started in terms of the Eurasian landmass down to Southeast Asia, and then today it extends to the Arctic region. It extends to South America. It's like anything, anyone can be part of the BRI if you want. Yeah. So that could actually be a saving grace for Xi Jinping at the end of the day, because the BRI is one of his signature initiatives. He cannot afford for it to fail. And under such circumstances, when you cannot afford to fail, you want it to be as ambiguous as possible. So at the end of the day, you can still claim victory, right? Whatever the outcome. If you had only one successful project in the BRI, you can claim that it's a victory. Yeah. But anyway, so back to the situation with the with the BRI and that trap. I think that is a concern for everyone, but it has to be a concern for China as well. I think no one we have to be somewhat suppose sympathetic to the Chinese situation as well. They've gone too far down the road to turn around, but people talk about, the best example is Hambantota, right? The Sri Lankan port. The Sri Lankan government can't pay for it, basically, so they've handed over the lease to the Chinese. So the Chinese will run it for, I think, 95 years or whatever. And everyone starts to talk about how the Chinese will start picking up these sorts of debt for equity assets. Now, if you were China, do you want to have a whole bunch of Hambantotas, right? 1, yes, 2, maybe, 10, 15 failed projects landing on your lap, and you're supposed to take care of them. I don't think they want that. But the problem is a lot of this has not been thought through properly, and not only has it not been thought through properly, you have a situation where it is a top-down directive, and I think therein lies a lot of the problems as well. It's top-down from the government. The government has to make it work. The Xi Jinping administration has to make it work. You work through the state-owned enterprises that you have very close links to, and not just the industrial companies, but the banks as well, the policy banks. And the policy banks start to give all sorts of loans at very questionable terms to their Chinese partners. So you can see how the bubble develops over time. And it's a huge risk for the Chinese. So I think that this trade war situation is difficult, not just, or it's difficult for the Chinese. I think it's going to be difficult for the US as well. Because while Trump thinks that he's going to win this trade war, I think he might win it, but I think the American people will be the ones who will have to pay. It is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but the way I characterize it is, if 3 years ago you go to Walmart and you buy a DVD player for $29.99, and now it costs $79.99, made in the USA, at what point does patriotism sort of give way to the rational economic man? So these are some challenges. But let me bring the discussion closer to home, to our region, maybe the last 10, 15 minutes. Southeast Asia, we find ourselves caught again between two major powers. Southeast Asia's existence is always about being caught between major powers, right? I mean, just look at the map alone. India, China, Japan, the United States. We are, of course, very concerned for the stability of the region. We are at a point where we have to really find some way to deal with the Chinese, who are increasingly assertive and increasingly clear in terms of what they want out of the region and where the region fits in their larger sort of outlook. I think if you were China and you want to talk about the expansion of China's, or not expansion, sorry, a projection of Chinese power and influence. If you look at the map, I don't have one here, but I'm sure you're very familiar with the map of Asia. China expands northwards, you run up against Russia, right? You expand eastwards, you run up against the United States. You run up against Japan, and behind it, the United States. You expand westwards, no one wants to expand westwards because that's the Middle East. We try to go around it if possible, right? You expand southwest is India. Then you expand southeast, it's Southeast Asia, right? Big state, big state, big state, messy like hell, big state, small little states, right? So it's a natural outlet. And once you expand out that way, what happens? You hit the South China Sea. And we all know the story of the South China Sea. The South China Sea appears to be one of the arenas now for the great power rivalry, as they call it, not just between the United States and China, but also many other regional powers. Japan, even the Europeans want in on the action, right? They send their ships once in a while to sort of let people know that the Europeans are still an actor of consequence, right? The British, the French, and I think that's about it. So the South China Sea, unfortunately for the countries of Southeast Asia, we call it if you look at the map of Southeast Asia, the South China Sea is right at the center. It is our heart, right? But at the same time, we are kind of losing control of it because all these freedom of navigation operations, the Chinese are building artificial islands and now they have place installations on them. We want to be very careful about this because the Chinese have developed, I think about six or seven, I don't know, something like that. They've reclaimed or built artificial islands out of a number of features, but the number that they have developed pales in comparison to the Vietnamese, who have 20 over. And even the Filipinos, I think, have more than that, more than what the Chinese have developed. But of course, it's not just the numbers; it's the magnitude and the size of the developments. If you've seen some of the pictures, so the Chinese are there to stay. The Chinese are there to stay. There's no way they're going. No one can get them to leave. Okay, let's be clear about that. No one can get them to leave. No one can get them to dig up the sand, pack it back in the sacks and then return it to wherever they got it from, right? So they are here to stay. The Chinese will have a physical military presence in the heart of Southeast Asia, right? Plain and simple. So what do we do with a Chinese physical presence in the heart of Southeast Asia? You ask Southeast Asians that, the answer is we don't know. We can pray. That sometimes helps. But beyond that, they don't really know. Why don't they know? Because they really are struggling to get their act together to deal with China or the US or Japan for that matter, the external powers. For countries of Southeast Asia, for ASEAN, getting some kind of alignment on any given strategic issue has always been a challenge. In fact, sometimes that in itself is the challenge, let alone the issue. That's why we have this celebrated ASEAN way, because we realize that just being able to agree on something, whatever that thing is, the act of coming to agreement is an achievement in and of itself. Those of you who come from big families, you will know exactly what I mean, right? To the point that the issue itself becomes immaterial. And therein lies the struggle for Southeast Asian states. They cannot get their act together on what to do, for example, in response to the Chinese. Part of the problem is, of course, in the South China Sea, not all the Southeast Asian states are claimant states, right? There are only 4, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, Philippines, 4 countries that are claimant states. Indonesia sometimes is a claimant, sometimes is not, depending on the Chinese map, right? So it's a 4.5, yeah. The other 5.5, and a lot of the 5.5, about 3 or 4 of the 5.5 really don't give a hoot. Part of the reason why is because they are pretty far away from South China Sea, number 1. Number 2, they are also pretty dependent on the Chinese for development. So they have a different approach altogether on the South China Sea. The only country that is not a claimant but is really freaking out about it is, of course, Singapore, right? Partly because we freak out about everything, right? Overly freak out about things most of the time, but also because of the waterways and the trade that ply those routes are very critical to us and to our survival, right? We are still very much a trading nation, dependent on trade. So any kind of instability there will create problems for us, which is why Singapore is in Southeast Asia, the one non-claimant state that is actually proactive. Proactive to the point that some of the claimant states, I won't name who, slap us down, right? And tell us you are not a claimant state, mind your own business, right? So there is this disconnect in the understanding of why Singapore is actively or why Singapore sees the South China Sea as very critical to us, despite the fact, or rather in spite of the fact that we are not a claimant state. Now, the Chinese, as I said, they've already staked a permanent presence in the South China Sea, and on that basis, they are a bit more confident dealing with ASEAN, Southeast Asia today, and they have actually laid out a timeline for the code of conduct. You know that they've been discussing, the ASEAN and China have been discussing the possibility of a code of conduct long time. But the Chinese, for the first time, have said that when Li Keqiang was in town in November last year in Singapore, he said that we'll get it done in 3 years. Right? So ASEAN is very relieved, because whenever ASEAN says we'll get it done, how we'll get it done, when we'll get it done and all that, they will all look at China, and then China will act blur, and then the whole endeavor sort of falls apart. But this time, the Chinese have taken the lead, at least in terms of identifying when the conclusion, or at least when the completion of the first full draft of the code of conduct should be done, which is in 3 years. Now, probably 2.5 years. Southeast Asia is very relieved, but we are also a bit anxious because we have no idea what the Chinese mean when they say completion of the code of, what idea they have when they talk about a draft of the code of conduct. I think, for example, what is the scope? What does it cover? The Vietnamese are very intent that the code of conduct has specific geographical references to the area which it claims, which is the Paracels, sort of upper South China Sea. The rest of Southeast Asia, we are like, you're kind of on your own on that one, because the other claimants do not claim the Paracels. Vietnam is the only claimant as far as and Taiwan, but that's a whole different issue, right? So the question is whether Southeast Asia, as I mentioned earlier, can get its act together and be on the same page as far as the negotiation with the Chinese are concerned. So that remains to be seen. Now, I think that it is imperative in this climate that Southeast Asia pursue a number of strategies beyond trying to get everyone united and on the same page. I think Southeast Asia also has to start looking elsewhere and at different configurations of diplomatic, defense, and trading relationships. I think for a long time, we've been too focused on our relation, or at least the traditionally non-communist countries of Southeast Asia. We have been traditionally too focused on the United States, which explains this anxiety, right, that we always have, whether the US is engaged in the region, whether the US is interested in the region. I think it's, this is a, you got to end on a high, so I'm trying to end on a high here. This is one of those situations where you try to find a silver lining and you think about it, it's like growing up, right? you're a kid, you depend on your parents. Not to say that Americans are our parents, but sort of the metaphor being used here, the family. As you grow up, you expand your circles. So Southeast Asia is learning now to expand its circles. It's deepening its relationships with many other players, necessarily so. And this needs to continue. The reason why it needs to continue is because we really don't want to be caught between these two major powers. It's not. You really don't want to be caught between major powers. And I will end with by making reference to the historical analogy that is like the sexy in thing now, which is the Thucydides trap, right? That the American political scientist Graham Allison wrote about. It's based on the history of the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. And what Allison does is he draws the analogy with the US and China today, right? So China is supposed to be Athens, the new the growing maritime power, who is challenging the status quo. And the United States is Sparta, right? The sort of the incumbent power that is finding its status challenged. Now, and then of course, everyone is talking about the US and China, Athens and Sparta. But for me, what I find interesting is the role of the smaller countries, the Greek city-states. Why is that interesting? It's interesting because, for starters, the Peloponnesian War was not fought only between Athens and Sparta. It was fought between two alliances, basically. The Delian alliance and the Peloponnesian alliance. Because the major powers were involving their smaller neighbors and their smaller allies in the battle, as allies do, right? The second interesting thing about the Peloponnesian War, which Allison seemed to have missed, and which actually makes the analogy rather weak, is the fact that Sparta was a very conservative power, right? It actually did not want to stand up to Athens, to the extent that Sparta's smaller allies were sort of prodding it to stand up against Athens, to stop the growth and expansion of Athenian power and influence. The United States, which people say is analogous to Sparta, the United States today is not, by any stretch of the imagination, it's conservative in some ways, but as far as its foreign policy is concerned, I don't think conservatism is the first word that comes to mind when you describe the not just the current administration, but even administrations before. Yeah. So why do I bring up this dimension as an example? I bring it up because, yes, we are looking at a situation where two of the greatest, most influential powers globally are at odds with each other, and at present, there's very little sign or indication that they can find some kind of modus vivendi to get on with life. But very often, great powers, being great powers, they would be more cautious in terms of provoking each other down the path of greater stress and strain, and then even to conflict. Very often it's prompted by outside forces, external to this dynamic. And if you look at it historically, very often it's smaller states who try to take advantage, for example, of the instability to get one or the other to support its cause, and then things start to spiral down from there. Okay, so it is quite not destabilizing, not turbulent. It's quite uncertain. It's quite an uncertain period that we have entered. I think not just in terms of the trade and economics of it, but a wider array of things also. I haven't had time to talk about that. The tech war, for example, and what the Americans are trying to do with Huawei. I think on that note, I think it speaks as much to the Americans as it does to China, right? I mean, all this pressure on Huawei and its 5G networks, and then you ask yourself why, and then I don't know about you guys, but for me, I come to the conclusion that at least part of the problem is because the Americans took their own eye off the ball, right? And Cisco was going nice and slow in its development of its own 5G capabilities, and then suddenly these Chinese fellas overtook it, and then it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. And that's my hypothesis, which I have no empirical evidence whatsoever to back it. But anyway, so on that note, I will end here, and then happy to have a discussion with everyone on this Friday evening. And you're all still here. Good.
Well, thank you, Professor Liao. I've seldom come across speakers, who are able to speak off the cuff for so long with rich contents and insights, and without referring to any notes or slides. So I think he deserves another round of applause. Today we are also very pleased to have a few our key personnel within NTU here. Professor Robert Kennedy, our Dean of Nanyang Business School, Professor KK Luke, our Associate Dean of HISS, of course, as well as Professor Luin, also our Associate Dean for HISS. Now, I think we will start with the Q&A. So I'll take my seat. Is there any question? First question? If not, maybe second question also fast. First question. Okay, the lady over there.
Hello, Prof, for the fantastic speech. So my question is about Singapore. So what is your forecast of the future of Singapore? Do you think it's, in your opinion, do you think it's brighter or relatively more challenging? If it is relatively more challenging in your opinion, what do you think Singapore can do to make it brighter? Thank you.
So the answer or your take? Okay. Is brighter and more challenging. How's that? I mean, there are a lot of. It's a very different world that we are headed into, right? With all the we call it disruptions and a number of things, right? The role of technology and the prevalence of technology and the impact on Singapore. You have the issue of an issue that the Europeans are grappling with, and the Americans as well are grappling with now, which is this populist mood, and if you push it further, even a bit of a sort of a chauvinistic kind of mood. It hasn't engulfed Singapore, but you do see, this reaction towards foreigners and that sort of stuff, right? So these are of course issues that the government has to deal with. I'm focusing on issues because the talk is basically more on sort of foreign relations, international affairs. So these are to some extent issues that feed off things that are happening elsewhere, but will obviously have a domestic narrative behind it as well. And I think one of the biggest issues that the Singapore government is going to face, the 4G government and the 5 and 6 and 7G government is going to face, is this question of Singapore identity. Why do I say that? In relation to, and this is the flip side of being a multicultural society, right? By definition, our people are from different cultural backgrounds, and these cultural backgrounds are sort of related or referenced to cultural homelands, right? China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia. And the question that is on the mind, whether it's a fair question, we can discuss that, but the question on the minds of our policymakers is whether or not Singaporeans would pay increasing attention to their cultural identity, and if they do, what is the impact on their sense of belonging and their sense of a relationship with the cultural, call it motherland. Yeah, you see this problem now with relations with China, and to be fair, it doesn't help that the Chinese government likes to sort of play up the cultural dimension as well. It's very interesting because the rise of China has been embraced not just by Chinese citizens, but embraced in a lot of places by ethnic Chinese. That is to say, Chinese who are not citizens of China, but who share equally in the pride of seeing China develop within one generation from the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution to the economic and technological powerhouse it is today, right? So that is a positive side of it, right? But the question is, what happens or how, whether or not these links can or have been used for other reasons, and you see that in the news today. Governments are sort of paying particular attention to their Chinese communities, for better or worse. Unfortunately, that is the state of affairs. And for us, it's not just a question of China. If the assumption is that the rise of China would prompt this in ethnic Chinese, then what if India realizes its potential and becomes the next economic powerhouse? India is very proud of its cultural heritage, and the ethnic Indians or ethnic South Asians in not just in Singapore but in Malaysia, in Thailand, other countries as well of the region, the same dynamic could hold. So how to manage that in the context of trying to build that national identity? I think that has been identified as a challenge. Whether or not it's an actual challenge, it's been identified as a challenge by the government.
Okay, I think there's one more question here in front. Can you pass him the mic?
Professor Leo, thank you very much for articulating all these ideas. Really much appreciated. My question stays within Singapore on the same theme, and it's a two-part question. So the first one is whether you could unpack a little bit about the different configurations that Singapore ought to consider for the future. And the second question points to the Singapore-based talent, the human capital in Singapore, and what needs to change, in your opinion. Any commentary as to how this group of individuals, working professionals, could apply themselves to be better prepared for these new configurations, diplomatic, geopolitical, geoeconomic, that Singapore will face in the future?
Okay, your first question, you said different configurations of what?
In the context of moving away from the dependencies on the superpowers and establishing Singapore, hedging Singapore in terms of commercial, diplomatic ties, etc.
Okay, thanks. Very good questions. And in a sense, they are correlated. So let me start by saying that Singapore, Singapore is in a very difficult position because we are in the Southeast Asian region, and of course, geographically, we can't sort of pack up and ship out. Right, we're stuck here, for better or worse. Because of that, it necessitates us prioritizing Southeast Asia. Right, that makes sense. And I think therein lies the problem. We are not particularly well loved in this part of the world, especially by our immediate neighbors. And it's a very complex very complicated story behind that. I could go on and on about it, but maybe not on a Friday night. But the fact of the matter is, it is very difficult. You look at the downturn in relations with Malaysia. Indonesia is holding, but there's a lot happening. In terms of the Indonesians wanting to take back control of the airspace over Riau and things like that. It is challenging also, but of course the spotlight is really on Malaysia. So we've always had this very odd position in Southeast Asia, and because of that, we've reacted in a number of ways. Number one is we, of course, try to be as proactive as possible given our development, given our resources, both in terms of the limitations of our resources, but also the fact that we are the richest country in Southeast Asia. We try to engage in a lot of capacity building in the region in the hope of sort of diplomatically winning friends, as everyone does. But at the same time, we also ensure that we don't. Okay, I'll put it this way: we don't speak out of turn. What I mean is that if you talk to Americans, if you talk to Chinese, if you talk to Japanese, all the major power, the Europeans, one thing that, and I've had a lot of interactions with them, and one thing they keep saying is that, Singapore, this whole idea of Singapore punching above its weight, in terms of the sort of strategic ideas that are generated from this part of the world, a lot of it comes from Singapore. Whether or not that's true, we can discuss. But to the extent that is true, Singapore has deliberately not played that up. And there's a reason why we do that. Because we don't want to be seen as upstarts, right? So we let the Indonesians lead, we let the Malaysians lead, we let whoever wants to lead. If Brunei wants to lead, good luck to them. Lead away, right? But therein lies the conundrum for us, the lack of leadership, the lack of practical, sustainable ideas means that Southeast Asia as a group of countries, making progress and moving forward is more difficult, right? And you're there, like, why can't we push this? So sometimes what we do is we seed ideas even, we have an idea, we go to the Indonesians, hey, look, why don't you guys take it and run with it? Yeah. So we find ourselves in that very difficult position, but we have no choice, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is because we see ourselves and our future really as part of Southeast Asia, one thing that we have tried very hard, and I talked about it earlier, is this question of integration and uniting Southeast Asia. Because as a former diplomat has said many times, the ASEAN states, you either hang together or you hang individually, right? Hang and hang, right? So hanging together is not an option for the countries of the region. It's not an option for Singapore. We have to work, regardless of the mistrust and the suspicions, we have to all work together, because if we don't, we are in trouble. The historical record has shown that external powers have always had a very keen interest in Southeast Asia. Right? Sometimes splitting it apart, sometimes, like the Japanese during the war, just gobbling up or trying to gobble up the whole place. What the region tried before, foolishly and naively, was to keep external powers out of the region. Then we realized that we're not big enough to do that. So now the strategy has turned 180 degrees. We try to engage external powers on our own terms, right? So for example, there's this concept of ASEAN centrality, which is a very intriguing concept. It's intriguing because it is an idea, you would think that it's an idea that grows out of some sense of strength and relevance. Whereas actually it's the reverse. The idea of ASEAN centrality is derived from a very keen sense of insecurity and irrelevance, hence the need to be relevant to the region, right? So we say that, okay, we engage everyone, all the external powers, on the basis of ASEAN centrality. So any kind of diplomatic engagement has to be focused on ASEAN, and we provide the platform. Now, and this idea really started to gain traction in the region immediately after the Cold War in the early 90s. And we got away with it for quite a number of years, for quite a number of decades. And the reason why was because all the other external powers around the region, they didn't have, I mean, there was no platform for them to engage. So ASEAN comes around and presents one. The external powers are happy to accede to it. So everyone, even today, everyone pays lip service to ASEAN centrality. But why do they pay lip service to ASEAN centrality? For a very simple reason. Because it doesn't get in the way of what they want to do, right? The moment it gets in the way of what they want to do, you can be pretty sure they will toss it out the window, right? But for now, the Chinese agree to it, the Americans agree to it, the Australians, the Japanese, everyone, right? So the problem for ASEAN is that you can't say, it's not like some magic word, you keep saying it often enough, suddenly, bam, you become central. You have to work at it. You have to demonstrate that centrality means something. And that is the challenge for ASEAN, because it's linked to my earlier point about ASEAN struggling to work together. So how can you claim to be the central entity in the regional enterprise if you can't get your act together to drive things? So it's always about this struggle. And Singapore, for our part, has our diplomats, for better or worse, with different degrees of success. Sometimes doing it the wrong way, but bless their hearts, they do try to generate this centrality. The human capital thing. Oh, the human capital thing. How to develop the human capital. We once thought that the way to develop it is to okay, let me rephrase the way I approach this. We have a problem with human capital simply because of demographics, right? So we have taken to importing human capital, the best and the brightest, but there are political costs to that, and the government has been feeling that cost for some time. So on the one hand, the government is not populist. Populism is a dirty word in Singapore. Ironically, it also starts with a P. But on the other hand, if you look at some of the measures that he has taken, I'm not saying it's populist, but the government has this problem that they have to deal with, right? In terms of the human capital, which is what the narrative tells us Singapore is dependent on, right? We've got no resources, we've got no land, we've got no this, we've got no that. We've only got human capital. We have benefited greatly from foreign talent, but for many years we have been, and this is something that I take a personal interest in, a particular interest in. We have benefited greatly from next door, Malaysia, right? Because the opportunities, because of the previous Malaysian government, the opportunities were just not there for Malaysians. And Singapore, in fact, up to 40% of educated, that is to say, white collar the Malaysian labor force that goes overseas is in Singapore, right? 40%. The other, I think probably another 40 is in Australia. Yeah. So these two countries probably command the lion's share, and we have benefited from it. Which is why when Penang, if you follow Malaysian politics in 2008, when Penang fell into opposition hand, well, now it's the incumbent, right? Back then it was the opposition, the DAP, the Democratic Action Party, and I say Penang in particular because it's one thing for back when the Barisan, when UMNO was in power, it's one thing for state governments to fall into PAS hands or PKR hands and all that, but you fall into DAP hands because the DAP actually has some ideas about economic development. The DAP actually is not particularly interested in enticing people to cross over to join their party. So when that happened, we started to see, and this is anecdotal, I don't have the figures, but it'll be interesting if you can get the figures. The number of Malaysian Chinese who worked in Singapore who are going back to rebuild, that's what they call it, rebuilding Penang. And they have stayed. I know some of them, and they've stayed on. So again, this is anecdotal, but I find it very interesting because it creates problems for us in a sense. But over and above just the people movement, I think this whole issue of embracing this again, I think Bob will snigger when I say the fourth industrial revolution, right? And it's a personal joke. But embracing the fourth industrial revolution that is upon us, right, is something that Singapore takes very, very seriously. I think we have a little bit of a, we are going to be quite fortunate in an odd sense because one of the problems, one of the discussions that they just had Davos, right, and it's always the same theme: the amount of jobs you're going to lose because of technology, blah blah blah. But for us, our demographics are going down anyway, right? So we are actually in a advantageous position, relatively advantageous position in terms of sort of riding the wave of digitization and technology. The challenge for us is going to be the impact of that on wealth disparities and growing inequality. That is going to be the challenge. Whether or not, because my guess is that technology, you could make a case that technology, could level the playing field, but on the other hand, certain segments of society are more well placed to embrace technology than others. From buying a smartphone to something as simple as that. So the one thing that Singapore needs to be very to watch very carefully is we're already having this problem with very great wealth disparity, and if embracing technology just widens that gulf, then there's a problem in the making, I think. Yeah.
Prof, I have a question. Prof, you mentioned that for a long time, right? Southeast Asia has been too focused on the US for regional security, and it must learn to expand its circles and diversify in order to avoid getting caught between the two superpowers. So my question would be, how should Southeast Asia and perhaps Singapore expand its circles to reduce the long-time dependence on the US for regional security, to address China's encroaching influence and presence in the region?
Yeah. Well, to be fair to Southeast Asia and Singapore, we have been doing that already, right? We've been engaging the other countries in the region. I think the funny thing is some of the regional powers have introduced this concept of the Indo-Pacific. I don't know if you have followed this, right? So it originated from the Japanese when Shinzo Abe was in fact, before he became the prime minister the first time round. I think he came into power like 2007 or something like that. But a few months before that, he had introduced this idea of Indo-Pacific, and people started talking about it, but it didn't really get much traction. The US administration, the current US administration, had revived that talk, and now it seems to have a bit more traction. So the Americans, the Australians, the Japanese, and the Indians are talking about it as well. Now, why do I bring this up? I bring this up because obviously it's a configuration that involves not just the US, but other regional powers. So Southeast Asia is presented with, and I use that word again, another conundrum, right? What is the conundrum? The conundrum is this. We are geographically at the center of the Indo-Pacific, right? Basically from the Pacific all the way to the Indian coast, and as far as the Americans are concerned, it ends at the east coast of India. As far as the Japanese are concerned, it goes all the way to the east coast of Africa. As far as the Indians are concerned, it goes up to the Persian Gulf. And the Americans say, nothing doing, Persian Gulf is our waters, you all stay out. Okay? But anyway, so that's the expanse of the Indo-Pacific, which locates Southeast Asia right in the middle. So we are right in the middle. So you want to talk about ASEAN centrality. Ironically, this is ASEAN centrality. But we are anything but central to this. Anything but central to this, right? And we are now in a difficult position because we cannot reject this outright. ASEAN has no position. ASEAN has no position on Indo-Pacific. We know we need to have a position. We are trying to get a position. We have probably 10 positions because there are 10 Southeast Asian countries. We cannot get our act together. So we are nowhere near a position, but we have to have a position. And one of the reasons why we hesitate to have a position on this is because of China, right? Simply, we don't want to endorse something that is seen as an effort to contain the Chinese, right? And the Chinese, for their part, are also relatively cautious when they approach this. They haven't condemned it outright. At least I don't think so. Yeah, obviously they haven't embraced it. They haven't condemned it. And then the Americans say that it is a free and open Indo-Pacific. That's what they FOIP, right? Free and open Indo-Pacific. Then we tell them, okay, it's free and open, but why don't you just include the Chinese in it, lah? Right? After all, it's free and open, right? So, okay, problem. So, but anyway, so we are in a difficult position because we see this as a platform, an important platform, because one of the reasons why is because it's got buy-in from the regional powers, and so it fulfills this this objective of having a platform, another platform to engage regional powers, right? But on the other hand, we are very careful because we are not in the business of omitting, or we're not in the business of keeping others out of our regional architecture. ASEAN's regional architecture building from the end of the Cold War has never been about keeping other interested parties out. So we have a problem with that is a sort of it's not an existential problem, but it's quite a fundamental problem with the free and open Indo-Pacific if it is not free and not open, right? And that is one of the problems that ASEAN has with it. But again, we cannot, and we are not going to outright reject it, because we are in the business of providing or supporting any platform that allows us to engage with a wide array of powers. I think the Indo-Pacific is interesting for us, regardless of the reservations. Is interesting for us because, number one, it's of course the US is involved, and to the extent that we still have this hang up about making sure that the Americans are engaged in the region, this is a means to sort of ameliorate that concern a little. But in addition to that, it's got the Japanese involved in a more sort of a proactive way. It's got the Indians involved, and it's always good to get the Indians involved. The question is just when they decide to go back home. The Australians are involved, but I mean, if there are Australians here, I don't mean to be insulting or anything, but you are fourth in the list of 4 countries. Yeah, but the fact is, it's a platform to engage them. So yes, we are already in the business of trying to build, facilitate, and be part of platforms to engage external powers. The only caveat is that we cannot be overwhelmed by them. And this is the risk. This is why ASEAN centrality is so important for us, a mirage as it might sometimes seem. Because we don't want to be overwhelmed, overshadowed, overrun diplomatically, by the external powers that we want to engage. So it's treading a very fine line, but bo pian, no choice, have to do.
Any other question? Oh, there's one of you.
Good evening, Prof. Allow me 2 minutes to elaborate.
Sure.
I watched a weekly news summary, and it was talking about Europe, how the Italian government is coming to a problem, and it influenced into France. I think if I'm not wrong, the Deputy Prime Minister went off to France to support the yellow jacket or yellow shirts who demonstrated throughout the weeks early this year. Basically, they are trying to give some support, and the French government, in this case, withdraw their ambassador back. First time after many years.
You mean Italy and France?
Yes. So this is geopolitics in Europe. And now the question of economics, geoeconomics. They're having a problem, according to the commentary, is because the have and have-nots, the point you mentioned, the gulf between those who can and those who cannot. We also have this problem in Singapore, which you mentioned a few times, and it worries you. So now we have the internet. This unhappiness is come to Singapore, come to this part of the world. And we have election every 5 years. So now I want to fast forward a bit. Before the Chinese and Americans come to some big disagreement, whether Trump get re-elected in 2020s, or is it 2020 or the next elections, will we have a problem on our doorsteps whereby this geopolitics is being imported via the internet, and we have election of unhappiness, and then we have problem internally in Singapore, and then we have a hung parliament, or at least our PAP government lose a few more seats, and then the politics will get involve us. So my point to you is that, have you looked into this aspect of different dimensions in this internet age of geopolitics? We don't have to be geographical between China and America. We don't have to be between Japan and Korea. But something else may come to us, a known, but hit us more like a swan. And if you have come across this, and what's your comment about it? This internet age, these disruptive points may come fast and furious, and we, being a small country, with a divided, both in race and in ideas and have and have-nots, will affect us badly. Thank you.
Okay. First, I would say I don't think the PAP will lose 50 seats. I honestly doubt, not in my lifetime, I don't think. I may be wrong. I think the crux of the matter that you pointed out is the influx of information and possibly misinformation or disinformation or fake news, as they want to call it, and how it affects people. I think this is certainly an issue that warrants very policy thinking and grappling with this. But having said that, a number of things. First is, I don't think you can really do all that much about it. You really can't police, unless you want to do it like certain countries have done, basically just firewall upon firewall. If not, it is very difficult for you to police what the information that is coming in. That's the first thing. The second thing is, we need to be mindful of something, and that is fake news is not the sole prerogative of non-state actors. Okay? What I mean is this. Yes, governments are dealing with this issue of fake news. Sometimes governments generate fake news to fight fake news, if you get what I mean. So you know, it's fair game. It's fair game. I don't think while we have to be cautious about this issue of fake news, we shouldn't think that it's crazy people working from their basements, generating fake news, and then governments are not progenitors of fake news, right? That I think is very important to bear in mind. I think that as far as Singapore is concerned, we do, because of how open Singapore is in terms of, certainly in terms of our economy and our trade, we are very susceptible to geopolitical shifts and developments, especially if it's developments that take things downhill, regardless of the internet. I mean, it could be developments that have very little to do with the internet or technology, but anything that destabilizes destabilizes the world will affect us. I think for the Singapore government, as far as the internet and information and mis and disinformation is concerned, one major touch point which would make them jump into action is when it relates to issues of race and religion. I think we all know that in Singapore, race and religion remain very sensitive issues. We can have a discussion, of course, whether Singapore society has matured enough that we can actually talk about our differences and all that. But that shadow that is cast by the history in terms of the building of Singapore, the shadow cast by racial and religious tensions is still very strong. And the fact that in our neighborhood, it continues to be played up, stoked with very negative consequences, only reinforces in our minds or the minds of our leaders that these are really issues that you want to keep out. So on those issues, there will be and there has been a very conscious and unapologetic effort on the part of government to keep out these influences, right? So that is the one sort of. I mean, I talked about the difficulties in terms of policing and managing information, but where it relates to these issues, the government, and again they are unapologetic, unabashed about this. They are uncompromising when dealing with it. Whether that is in the long run good or bad, we can discuss, but that is how they have approached it. Yeah.
I think this question, maybe over here first.
Hi, good evening, Prof. Thank you for being with us here tonight. So my question has to do with, do you think it's a worthy aim for Singapore and ASEAN to strive to be something like the EU in terms of a shared economic zone and the flow of labor and capital, or has that gone out of fashion already?
As far as economic integration is concerned, yes. In fact, we've been trying to do that, right? Common. I don't think we'll get a common currency, but some sort of common market and a better flow of labor services. I think that can be improved and improve significantly. Yeah. But having said that, I think the EU is a larger project. There's for a long time, people have been making this sort of comparison, drawing parallels, similarities and differences. My own view is that it cannot replicate the EU. ASEAN cannot replicate the EU. And to some extent, I don't think we want to as well. And of course, we also know that the EU project now is under a bit of strain. the British have voted out. And in fact, I think the rest of Europe is deliberately playing hardball with Britain to impress upon impress upon not the British, because the British are so-called lost cause, right? They really voted to impress upon the rest of Europe that it's probably not a good idea to sort of start things rolling in that direction, right? Which explains why, as far as Brussels is concerned, nothing doing. We're not interested in Theresa May's various. It keeps getting shot down anyway in Parliament, let alone coming to to Brussels. Yeah. But I think that they are very different. Nevertheless, the idea of greater integration that you suggest, especially economic integration, I think is actually quite critical for ASEAN. And I think there we can learn some lessons from Europe. Yeah. We are supposed to have an ASEAN economic community, but it is just quite ridiculous. The level, for example, of intra-ASEAN trade, is really at a very dismal level. And it already is at a very dismal level, but about 85%, I think something 85% of intra-ASEAN trade is between Singapore and Malaysia. Yeah, it's between Singapore and Malaysia. So if we take us out of the equation, it's even worse. It's even worse, So there's a lot of room for improvement. But that's the thing with ASEAN. I mentioned earlier that for Xi Jinping, the BRI deliberately left ambiguous because whatever at the end of the day is it, right? And they can claim success. That's how ASEAN approached the ASEAN Economic Community as well, right? They said that we will have an ASEAN Economic Community by the end of 2015. That's to say 31st December 2015, right? And when 31st December 2015 came around, surprise, surprise, we announced we have an ASEAN Economic Community. What it is, that one later we talk. But we announced first that we have an ASEAN Economic Community, right? So a lot of room for improvement, on the economic and trade front.
There's one question, I think, behind the green gentleman in green. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for your talk so far. I was thinking when you mentioned during your talk about the situation on the South China Sea and the position of the other claimant countries and the dangers that that situation represents for Singapore as a trading nation, the importance that trading has for Singapore, right? So I was wondering, what would be, in the case of worst scenario, the outcome of this particular situation, right? How likely is that to happen, and what would that mean for Singapore in terms of, maybe losing its position as a trading nation?
Okay, I don't. If you ask me, I don't think we are looking at the prospect of open conflict. I don't think that that is going to happen for a number of reasons. I think the Chinese know on the part of China. I think they know it's not in their interest to get involved in any military altercation, whether it's with the United States or with the regional states. And the Chinese, to be fair to the Chinese, I think they are trying very hard to improve the understanding and the diplomatic relationship with Southeast Asia. It's just that sometimes it's like ships passing in the night, right? You have a different sort of two parties can look at the same picture and derive different conclusions. So I give you an example. The Chinese are very proud of the fact that they have a long record of historical engagement with Southeast Asia. And one of the examples they always use is Zheng He, Admiral Cheng Ho, right? And his, the Muslim, he was a Muslim eunuch, right? And they talk about how he brought good tidings of China, is it the Ming Dynasty, I think? Yeah, to Southeast Asia, right? And it was a peaceful mission. Turn it around. You are the sultan of a small little sultanate off the coast of Malacca. Okay? Your admiral tells you that, boss, something is coming in the horizon. So you go to the beach, and very nice beach, right, Malacca? Yeah. You look out into the South China Sea, you see a fleet of several hundred vessels, the smallest of which is multiple times larger than your largest vessel, sailing towards you. You get what I mean? You will have a different perspective from the Muslim eunuch admiral who's on that huge ship with another 299 behind him, coming on a peace mission, right? It's all about perception. It's all about perception. Yeah. For Southeast Asia and China, it is not a fundamental difference. It is about perception. It is about perception. The Chinese, and even for China and the United States, the Chinese feel insecure because of the kind of surveillance operations that the United States is conducting just off the coast of China, right? And from a national security perspective, it's perfectly understandable that a state is concerned about that. Yeah, because the Americans have a very different interpretation of what the UNCLOS allows them to do as far as military activity compared to the Chinese. Yeah, the Americans, on the other hand, are concerned because there's a China that is rising, that seems to be increasingly assertive, and to be fair, a lot of the regional states are telling the Americans as well that, we need you around because of the uncertainties, especially with regards to Japan and China. It's not China itself dealing with us, but the Japanese and the Chinese are not exactly the best of friends, right? So even if something happens there, it's going to affect Southeast Asia. So the Americans have a particular perception of what's going on. So these perceptions and misperceptions, I think that is the source of a lot of the tension. Not the it's not the manifested security dilemma or the manifested actions that underlie the security dilemma, but it is the perception that states have. So the problem for the South, for everyone in the South China Sea, is how to prevent an accidental conflict, an accidental conflagration. And here is where we're concerned, where you have a lot of ships, coast guards, military, navy vessels, submarines, aircraft carriers, commercial tankers, plying the South China Sea, up, down, up, down, up, down, and with this issue of states claiming this, claiming that, you get a bit concerned that something might happen. So that's why the code of conduct for Southeast Asia, for ASEAN, is very important, to try to come up with some kind of understanding to manage that dynamic. It's not meant to solve. This is where some people have the idea that the code of conduct is meant to solve the problem, and so whether it's legally binding or not, and if it's not legally binding, it's not helpful. All that. That's actually peripheral to the discussion. The main issue is just an effort to try to foster a better understanding in order to prevent an accidental clash from happening in that part of the world. Because given the tension, an accidental clash can quite easily cascade into something more serious, right? So if we don't have some kind of mechanism that can be activated, that can kick in immediately in the event of a clash, or even better, prevent it, but if not, to kick in to sort of handle the immediate effect, it can very easily cascade. And we already see that in Chinese Coast Guard vessels ramming fishing boats, cutting seismic cables. I was just in Malaysia recently and met up with some friends in the defense ministry, and they were telling me that Chinese Coast Guard vessels had sailed all the way down off the coast of Sabah and were cutting the seismic cables of exploration vessels. So a lot of these things going on. a lot of these things going on. So it won't be open conflict, but it will be these sorts of little issues that would threaten to break out if we don't manage it.
There's one question in front here. Yeah. Right over here, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Prof. I think just now you mentioned that Donald Trump got it wrong about Kim Jong-un. And I think perhaps I would like to know your opinion on that. And what's on complete irreversible, verifiable denuclearization? Is that a viable option? And in that case, if it's not a viable option, how does it play out in the Southeast Asia and that on Singapore? Thanks.
Okay. I don't think it's a viable option, quite simply because when you have a state or a regime, for that matter, that has such an acute sense of insecurity, very acute sense of insecurity, and which had invested 77 plus decades, 70 over years, to get nuclear deterrent capability, that you're going to use it as to trade for anything. I don't think that is going to happen. Yeah, so I don't see that happening. So in that sense, I don't think that the nuclearization or disarmament is anywhere near the horizon as far as North Korea is concerned. If you ask me, I think the North Korean gambit is to dangle that possibility, and they've done it many times before, by the way, to dangle the gambit is to dangle that possibility to extract whatever it can, in terms of the lifting of sanctions. And here is where my view may differ from some others. It is not sanctions on the part of the Europeans and Americans as far as Pyongyang is concerned, because the North Koreans are not dumb. They know they know that the Americans and the Europeans will eventually wise up, and assuming that they ease up on the sanctions, they will then reimpose the sanctions, right? Like, Myanmar, they're talking about that now for Myanmar. For Pyongyang, it is working on the Russians and working on the Chinese. Because one thing that Donald Trump managed to do successfully, and personally I even cringe acknowledging that, is that he managed to get the Russians and the Chinese to go along with international sanctions, the heaviest sanctions that the Chinese have ever signed off on North Korea, right? And I think that, together with the unpredictability of this American president, usually American presidents, they threaten to blow you to kingdom come. You're like, okay. But this guy might actually be crazy enough to do it. Yeah. So that, I think it's like he's out crazied Kim Jong-un, right? And so I think that was the main calculation on the part of Kim Jong-un. But he was very smart. Before he met Donald Trump in Singapore, he went to Beijing to pay deference to Xi Jinping. And immediately after he met Donald Trump, he went to Beijing again to report on the meeting to Xi Jinping. Right? So he was very careful to keep China on side, to keep Russia on side, even as he stretched out his arm to Donald Trump. And as a result of that, the Chinese and the Russians have started to waver on this issue of international sanctions. The sanctions are still there. The Chinese have started to relax on their part, and now the narrative has changed already for China. The narrative now is that you got to give the regime, or give Kim Jong-un a chance to enact the kind of reforms that in his New Year message he had stated very clearly. So this is why they have chosen Vietnam for later this week, or next week, to meet, because the Vietnam offers could potentially offer Pyongyang
a model of economic development without surrendering military capability, without liberalizing the political the political climate. Yeah, and they have already been engaging the Vietnamese. The North Koreans have been engaging the Vietnamese for some time already to try to learn the secret of the opening up, the Domoy policy of economic opening up. So I think that if you ask me, I think that is the game that Kim Jong-un is playing. At some point, the United States, I don't know about Donald Trump, but at some point, the United States will realize that it's not going anywhere. But the gambit is by the time that happens, you have managed to get the Russians and the Chinese back on site with you. So actually, if you think about it, and some people were talking about this that Kim Jong-un should win the Man of the Year award last year, simply for the genius in how he played the major powers. And I think you look at the situation now. You've got the Americans basically acknowledging you. This is something that they've always wanted, right? Short of the sort of peace treaty, they've always wanted American acknowledgement, and all the living presidents and all the living former secretaries of state and defense had warned Donald Trump, whatever you do, don't meet the guy until you get concrete concessions, right? Because that you are surrendering the one thing that they have been working on for decades, apart from the nuclear weapons. Yeah, but Trump went ahead to meet, right? He's managed to weaken Chinese resolve in supporting the international sanctions. And Russians, not difficult to weaken the Russian resolve, yeah? But nevertheless, so he's got the Chinese and the Russians on site, right? He's got the South Koreans rolling out the red carpet for him. He's got the Japanese freaking out because the Japanese are very upset because all this is happening and they're on the sidelines. No one talked to them. Donald Trump didn't bother to talk to Shinzo Abe, so that Golden Golf Club or whatever it is that they gave the man, didn't amount to anything. So you think about it in terms of the sort of the great game kind of diplomacy. I think North Korea the last year, the last year has done an incredible job. I mean, you think about it objectively, they've done an incredible job. Kudos to them.
Well, I think let's have two more questions. So one over there. Yeah.
Hi, Prof. So in recent years, we have seen more and more hacking against government institutions, and Singapore is no stranger to this. So I'm wondering, what's your take on, what kind of improvement Singapore can make? And given this is not a problem just for Singapore, do you foresee some kind of regional architecture in cyber defense?
I think increasingly there is a realization. So ASEAN and the ADMM is the ASEAN Defense Ministers Forum, because they see this as a security issue. So they are trying to work together. One of the problems, there are a number of problems, right? One is getting a regional regime to govern these cyber interactions. The second is the fact that different states have different levels of development, different capabilities, and using different networks, different platforms. So I think it's difficult to devise a one-size-fits-all regime to cover everything. The third is this issue of, and here is where it gets murky, right? Who is doing the hacking? I mean, you have the commercial hackers, but you also have state agencies, right, who are engaged in hacking. And this becomes a problem, this becomes a diplomatic problem, right? In the sense that if you want to have a discussion in ASEAN about the vulnerabilities of the cyber networks, you have to talk about not just what the vulnerabilities are, but where the threats are coming from. So what do? Do you talk openly about some of the suspected culprits? I think that is a diplomatic political challenge as well. And I mean, in that sense, it's no different from other sort of security issues where you have to pinpoint certain countries. So I give you an example. For the record, I'm not saying that the Chinese are doing the hacking, but I use this example. The South China Sea, for example, right? That whatever sort of ASEAN documents, this, they deliberately try to not name countries, whether it's China, Philippines, or whoever. It's always just a generic expression of concern, for the stability of the South China Sea, which is fine, which is good. But if you want to do something about it, at some point you might have to start to discuss, even in closed doors, about who is engaging in activities that is causing the instability in the first place. That is not an easy proposition in the context of ASEAN. So there are a lot of obstacles to the effort to actually try to do something, even though everyone acknowledges that is the concern, and that really is one of the next frontiers, right? As far as security is concerned. That was at the back.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Prof. Love your enlightened insights, and thank you for all the teachings. So, as you noted, to end on a bright note, challenging
yes,
note.
we should.
Here's a long-term question. When we look at superpowers and hegemonic stability, it is always about both a political power, economic power, and military power. So, being that in Singapore, we're the #1 investor, foreign direct investor in the PRC, yet our ideology is much more aligned with the Americans. How might you predict the future? We've gone through historically superpowers, the Dutch, the Spaniards, and then when we look at peace, Pax Britannica with the Industrial Revolution, and then after World War II, Pax Americana. In the 90s, we had always thought it would be Pax Nipponica. That did not materialize because of the dot-com craze, Clinton doctrine, and then the Gulf War. So we ended up with a second American hegemony. How might you predict? Is it going to be Pax Sinica coming, the China century, or is it a continuation?
It's going to be Pax Simerica. No, okay, good question. First is, I think that the predictions of the decline of the United States, and it's very fashionable to do that, I think those are seriously overplayed. I think we're talking about a country that has a much deeper reservoir of resilience than they are given credit for, or at least today. Yeah. So I don't think that it is a question of the United States being replaced within the next few decades. My crystal ball only see the next few decades. No, but seriously, we don't know, right? We don't know. But looking at current trends, I don't think that that's going to happen. Of course, China is going to one day, if it hasn't already, depending on the figures, is going to overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world, right? That's just a matter of time. But does that mean that it's the end of the world for the US as a great power just because it becomes the second largest economy in the world? That's a very alarmist kind of prognosis, which I think doesn't hold water, right? Doesn't hold water. I mean, China is in many respects still trying to catch up now, right? With or trying to close the gap with the US, let alone overtake it, trying to close the gap. But already we are seeing the Chinese as a great power. The only people who don't see the Chinese as a great power are some of my Chinese friends. They always say, no, we're not a great power. But the rest of the world, again, matter of perception, right? The rest of the world sees China as a great power for all intents and purposes. Which leads to my second point, China. China is going to assume that position. China is going to assume that position. I mean, there are few things more certain in the. I mean, there are few things certain in the world apart from death and taxes, as they say, right? So this may not be certain, but on current trajectory, I think that it is very likely that we are looking at two superpowers, and I want to be careful about saying that it will be a bipolar world, because when you say it's a bipolar world, you hark back to the Cold War, but China is, or the Soviet Union was nowhere near what China will be and can be, nowhere near, right? So the analogy of the Cold War superpower rivalry is totally off. The Soviet economy was doomed from day one. It was doomed from day one. It was just a matter of time, right? And it took 50 years, but it was a matter of time. 50 years after the Second World War. China is a very different proposition altogether. In fact, it's the first time globally where you are looking, where the incumbent superpower is seeing the rise of if I may use the term challenger, which is rising on all scores, and rising on the back of a very different political culture. And this is something that everyone, not least of which the Americans, are trying to grapple with, because the understanding was always that, unless there is open sort of liberal political culture, at some point you're going to stumble. At some point you're going to stumble, like the Soviet Union did, right? But that does not appear to be the case at present with China. We don't know what will happen in the future. It could well meet some challenges, right? But on current trajectory, you're looking at a world where there's two major powers. So a number of things flow from that, upon which stability hinges. Number one, the relationship between the two of them. In fact, that's the main thing, right? And when I say the relationship between the two of them, I want to be careful. Of course, if the two of them are at each other's throats, that's not good, right? But on the other hand, if the two of them are so good pally buddies, I don't think that's good either. You remember all that talk about the G2 and all that? I don't think that's a situation where we want, where everything is sort of like managed between the United States and China without any sort of input or consideration for other voices, other actors. That's not what we want. We want very much a peaceful, multipolar world, right? So how they manage their relationship is going to be quite integral, and how they align their sense of, if I may use the term, their sense of responsibility for the rest of the world. What do I mean by that? Not the G2 model, but if you look at the United States, why is it that on balance, the United States is viewed with less suspicion than China? And why is China taking actions to address that? The reason is because, number one, when the United States came into prominence after the Second World War, it built institutions. Of course, it made sure that it sat at the top of the hierarchy of these institutions, right? World Bank, IMF, all that. But the fact is, they built institutions, they underwrote institutions that provided for the greater good. Number two, they never had any, I think it's fair to say that, they never had any territorial claims upon other states, right? At least from the Second World War onwards. And These are lessons for China. And China realizes that, right? So it's trying to build institutions. So the BRI is not an institution, but there is potential there. I think the Chinese would do themselves and the world a great favor if they multilateralize the BRI. You know, what happens when you multilateralize the BRI? Number one, you would dispel some of the suspicions about your intentions, right? Number two, you can ensure or at least demonstrate concern for better governance of these projects, right? And number three, China actually has a ready-made institution called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which China started, which China is the biggest shareholder, but it's got, 60 over 70 members, right? Use that rather than your policy banks, or your policy banks can feed the funding into the AIIB and use that as a platform. Then no one can accuse you of trying to, get countries into debt traps and things like that, And if projects fail, no one's going to point a finger at you. They'll be pointing the fingers at the AIIB, right? But on the other hand, because China is the main shareholder of the AIIB, it still bears the signature of China as a leader of the initiative. Perfect. So can someone tell Xi Jinping? Right? So building institutions. The second issue is, of course, territorial claims. And that is where it gets messy. China has territorial claims against the claims of other countries. But the nature of territorial claims is that you really believe that this is your sovereign territory. And states don't normally relent on sovereignty, especially when it is expressed in terms of, land, physical manifestation of sovereignty. So that one is going to be particularly challenging for the Chinese, but it's not going to hold China back.
Well, I think many of you still have a lot of questions to ask Professor Liao. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we have to stop here. I'd like to thank you for your active participation. Of course, let's put our hands together to also thank Prof. Liao for spending so much time answering all your questions. All right, now before you go, I would like to present a small token of appreciation to Prof. Liao. Yeah. And don't forget this. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for staying. Yeah, thank you, and have a very, very wonderful weekend.